Sorry about that, guys. Some nights I forget that I'm the guy that's supposed to be teaching. I mean, I remembered. Obviously, I got to study together, but I didn't put my headset on. All right, we're going to be in the book of Genesis tonight, as we've been going through the Genesis on Wednesday nights. We are going to be in chapter 3. And get my notes up here. Cool. We're going to be in chapter 3, verse 10. We're only going to make it, I think we only made it to like 9 verses last time. I think we're only going to make it 9 verses tonight as well. So Genesis chapter 3, starting in verse 10, it says, "So he said, I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself. And he said, who told you you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you that you should not eat? And the man said, the woman who you gave to be with me, she gave me of the tree, and I ate. And the Lord said to the woman, what is this you have done? The woman said, the serpent deceived me, and I ate. So the Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, you are cursed more than all the cattle and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you shall go, and you shall eat dust all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. To the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Then to Adam he said, because you have heeded the voice of your wife, and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it, cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat of the herb of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return. Heavenly Father, Lord, I thank you for this section of text, Lord. I ask, as always, Lord, that you would give wisdom as we read through it, as we break it down, Father. That your Spirit would fill me to overflowing right now, Lord, so that I might be able to do this job of which you called me to do. I ask, Father, if there's something, Lord, that you have prepared that I've overlooked, Lord, that you would just give me that right now to speak to your people. If there's something that is needing to be said to the hearts of those here tonight, Lord, that you would break through, that you would allow that to happen. I ask, Father, again, that you would just allow us to have soft hearts, Lord, humble minds, that we would receive your word with gratitude and thankfulness, Lord, even the parts that hurt a little bit. We thank you, Father, for your presence in this room tonight and for your scriptures. And in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. I like jokes. I like to tell jokes, not specifically from the pulpit, but I have one that's a favorite of mine that you will hear me say at least twice if we go through the entirety of the Bible tonight. Or not tonight, but through. Yeah, we're going through the entire. I know I haven't been able to make it through not even 9 verses in one night, but we're going to go through the whole Bible. So I'm going to tell you guys a joke because it pertains to this section of Scripture. So there's a new pastor that just recently took over a church, and he's wanting to make sure that he knows the people in his community. So he's going door to door, knocking on people's doors, seeing if they're home, introducing himself, wanting to say, hey, I'm the new pastor in town. And he goes to this one house in particular, and he knocks on the door. And he can hear that there's people inside, but nobody's coming out. So he knocks on the door again, and the people still don't come out. So he takes out his little notepad, a sticky pad, and he writes on it, Revelation 3:20. Revelation 3:20 says, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come to him and dine with him, and he with me. And he leaves and he goes back. And the next Sunday, he does his sermon. They take the offering, and at the end of the service, he gets the offering, and he sees his sticky note on it written Revelation 3:20. And he flips it over, and on the back side of it, it says Genesis 3:10. So he said, I heard your voice in the garden. I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself. So anyways, yeah, I like to find any excuse I can have to have that joke, and you'll hear it again when we go through Revelation chapter 3 as well. So If you recall, where we're at is we're doing this thing that was completely unplanned, where we're just starting on the response. And the response tonight is one from Adam, and he's talking to God. So if you haven't been here the last few weeks or last week at all, we saw that the serpent entered into the garden, that he deceived Eve, and that she ate of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil when she was not supposed to. And she convinced her husband Adam to do the same. And because they had sinned, they realized that they were naked, and they decided that they needed to hide themselves. So they covered themselves, they sewed together clothes with fig leaves. And when they heard God's voice in the garden, when they heard him approaching as they would walk with him in the cool of the day every single day, this time, instead of going towards him, they ran away and they hid from him. And where we ended in verse 9 is where God called out to Adam and he said, "Where are you?" And again, the reason he said, "Where are you?" was not because he didn't know where they were. This was the plea of a desperate father looking for their child that has gone in the wrong direction. And so that's where we enter into our text tonight. Verse 10 is the response that Adam gave to the Lord when he said, "Where are you?" And as we've read several times, he said, "I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked." So he starts there, "I heard your voice in the garden." Again, we realize that what Adam and Eve, every day, they've been in fellowship with the Lord for as long as they've been on earth. Now, we don't know exactly how long that was. I mean, was it a couple of years? Was it a couple of days? Not really sure. I tend to think it was a little bit on the shorter side of things because they hadn't eaten of the tree of life yet. But they've had this relationship with God where it's a friendly relationship. When they see him, where they hear him coming, where they hear his voice, they're willing to go out and meet him. And for the first time ever, they hide themselves. Just wonder what that must have been like for Adam and Eve for the first time ever in their life to be afraid of the Lord. Now, I can remember, there's been several times in my life when I've been afraid of the Lord, for sure. And we talked about this whenever we were going over the announcement of Jesus' birth. When the angel is talking to Mary, he talks about that he will be feared, that the Lord will be feared. And we talked about the differences of what that word means, about being afraid and then to revere the Lord. And part of that is that we're afraid because he's scary. And the little kids, they have the thing that they do when they're talking about the gospel, and it says that God is righteous and he must punish sin. And for that, he's scary. And for us, we understand that. We know that because we come from a place where we've sinned in our lives. From the time that we were very, very small and little, we've sinned. Probably not been a moment in your guys' life or to your recollection where you have not sinned within your life. And so we always understood this idea that God is righteous and he must punish sin. But for Adam and Eve, full-grown adults, for the first time in their lives, to hear God's voice and they're afraid suddenly. This new feeling to them that they've seen as God has entered into the garden. They had no reason to fear God before they had sinned. God is righteous and he must punish sin, but they had no sin in their lives until now. Now they have sin. The natural response of mankind is to be afraid whenever we have sinned, because God is able to punish us, and it's his personage, it's his character that he wants to punish sin. But for us, what we also have the knowledge of is that Jesus paid the penalty that we deserve so that we can live in the same emotional state as Adam and Eve pre-fall. We are in a perfected state. This is what 1 John chapter 4, verse 17 and 18 has to say. It says, "Love has been perfected among us in this, that we may have boldness in the day of judgment, because as he is, so are we in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves torment. But he who fears has not been made perfect in love." So for us, we have an understanding of what sin is. We have an understanding that God is righteous and that he has to punish sin, and that we should be fearful of that punishment that is coming towards us. But we also know that Jesus paid for that sin, and so therefore, there is no more fear. That perfect love that God has had for us, that perfect love has cast out fear for us. We don't have to be afraid of torment. We don't have to be afraid of judgment if we place our faith in Jesus Christ and what he's done. There's no longer that hiding ourselves that we have to do, like Adam and Eve were wanting to do. They wanted to hide themselves from the Lord. There's no longer that feeling for us. We get to live in a relationship with God like Adam and Eve pre-fall. So long as we understand this, so long as we accept that gift that Jesus has placed at our feet and said, just pick it up. That's all you have to do. Just pick it up. There's nothing you've done to earn it or anything that you deserve it for. Just pick it up. That's what he says. And so I'm going to throw out a point of application. I know it's kind of early and I haven't said much yet, but there's a point of application here for you guys. If you were to meet God tonight, you walk out these doors, you get on the highway and get hit by a semi-truck, and you're in the presence of God, what's your immediate response right now? Do you feel fearful to come before his judgment? Or are you prepared, knowing that you have the perfect lawyer and that you will be viewed as perfect and sinless and righteous before God's eyes? What is your response? Honestly, look at yourself and ask yourself, what is your response? If you feel fear, then just like it says there in First John, he who fears has not been made perfect in love. And if your response to meeting God in judgment tonight, if God was to come into the room tonight and say, hey, Chris, where are you? Hey, insert your own name there, right? Where are you? Do you feel that you need to run and hide from him for something that you've been doing that you have not brought to his attention, that you have not confessed before him? Is there something that you're holding in your hands and therefore you can't pick up the free gift of God? So just a point of application, because of course we're talking about these guys, and foolishly they hid themselves. And when Adam is asked about this, he's saying, where are you, Adam? He says, I heard your voice in the garden and I was afraid because I was naked. That's the excuse that Adam gives. Adam attributed his fear to the wrong cause. He wasn't afraid because he was naked. That's not why he was afraid. He was afraid because he had sinned. Immediately, the excuse, the motive behind why he's hiding from God was not the truth. Now, I don't know if he was aware that he was lying or if it was some sort of unconscious explanation that he was saying, look, I feel fearful. I don't know why I'm fearful. I realize that I'm naked now, so this must be the reason why I'm afraid. This is why I had to go and run in fear. But his response is, I hid myself because I was naked, but that's not the reason that he was afraid. Unwittingly, he was digging himself a deeper hole, right? When he starts to lie and you're like, well, what is it that you were doing? Oh, I was just, hanging out over here in the living room. It's like, okay, well, dishes are broken in the kitchen. What did you drop? It's like, there's evidence that you were over there, but you're saying that you're over here. And we're going to see that that's kind of the case with Adam here, is that there's evidence on him of what he was actually doing. There's evidence of why he was actually afraid, and it wasn't because he was naked. It was misplaced. His excuse could very much have been a misplaced understanding. Right? He was able to see the effects of his sin, but he didn't confess, or he didn't give responsibility of those effects to the actual sin that he had committed. He didn't say, I was afraid because I did something that you said I shouldn't do, Lord. I was afraid because I disobeyed you. And when you came into the garden, I was afraid of what might happen because of that. He doesn't say that. He says, I was afraid because I was naked. Now, the reason he's naked, we understand it from what we were talking about last week. Like, I believe that they were clothed in righteousness, in the righteousness of God. And that although they were naked, they did not have perception about that with each other because they had God's righteousness clothing them and covering them. And the second that they sinned, the righteousness was gone. God's light covering on them was gone. And they were able to see this here, that they were naked. And he doesn't understand what the purpose is there. So he, again, maybe he was lying. Maybe that was his first instinct. Maybe he says, I've got to cover this up. And we don't know how old he was. I tend to believe, again, that he was pretty young. So like a toddler, right? Even though you have them caught bold-faced in the act of doing something, they might make up a lie to try and cover it up, even though it sounds crazy and unreasonable. Maybe that's what Adam was doing. Maybe he just simply didn't understand the effects of his sin. More points of application for you guys tonight. There's probably going to be quite a few. Right? Are you seeing some sort of repercussion in your life from some sin that you've committed that you're not giving credit to the sin for the repercussion? Is there something in your life that's going on that you want to blame something else instead of looking at the root cause, the sin that's in your life? Right? Like, oh man, me and my wife are fighting a lot. And I guess we're just not seeing eye to eye, right? Or is it because you've been doing something that God does not approve of? That there's a root cause and a reason for that fight to have occurred? Or are you just looking at the symptoms? Are we people who want to diagnose the symptoms rather than the root cause? That's what Adam is doing here. He's diagnosing the symptom of his sin, but he's not confessing the root cause. He's not telling the Lord what the reason is as to why he now understands that he's naked. He says, I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid, for I was naked, because I was naked, and I hid myself. Poor, dumb Adam. And I say that, but again, like we talked about this last time, it's like part of what we do with religion is sometimes we want to cover ourselves up, sometimes we want to run away. And so this is a natural response. And I say dumb Adam because he literally I don't think he knew better. He thought he could actually hide from God. What other reason would you go and run and try and hide if you didn't think that it was actually going to conceal you? He didn't have the scriptures and the evidence and the things that we have. I pulled one scripture, but there's a whole bunch of it. I'll give you one of them just for your notes if you're taking them. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 3. The eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good. I get pretty amazed by that idea. That God is, I understand, God is omniscient, omnipotent. He sees everything. He knows everything. But this proverb where it says he's keeping watch on the evil and the good. Now there's an interesting question as well. He sees the evil, but does nothing to stop it. He saw the whole thing that happened with Adam and Eve in the garden. But he didn't cry out from his voice and allow her to hear and say, hey, watch out. That guy's a snake. No pun intended. Don't listen to him. He didn't stop there. And again, we've talked about this, and we've gone into this a little bit. There is room that's given that we are able to make choices for ourselves, that we are allowed to control the outcome of one decision or another, and this is what God is doing. So he sees everything, and he has seen. He saw the whole conversation in the garden. He saw what Adam had done. He sees where Adam is right now, and he's asking questions. He says there next, I believe it's verse 11 there. He said, who told you you were naked? God is abundant in his mercy. Abundant in his mercy. And I know that seems like it's coming out of left field, but it's not. He doesn't storm in. He saw everything. He knows everything that has happened. He knows exactly where Adam is hiding, but he doesn't storm in. He doesn't get angry and start screaming, yelling that his authority has been ignored. He finds Adam and he asks him questions. He's abundant in mercy that he is giving Adam opportunity to confess. 3 times, actually. He says, where are you? Again, the proper response that Adam should have says, I'm right here. I screwed up. I did something wrong. Can you imagine what the world would be like if that was Adam's response? What the difference of the world would be, what the story would be like if his response was different? We know that God forgives whenever people confess openly and willingly, just like David. We're going to go over one of the verses here where he confesses. He says, I have sinned. What if we knew Adam as the man after God's own heart instead of David? How different the world would look today if he had just confessed. But God comes in and he asks him questions and he gives him opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to confess his sin. He says, where are you? That was the first chance. He could have confessed right then and there. And he says, I was afraid, I was naked, so I hid myself. And God says, who told you that you were naked? Again, giving opportunity. It wasn't that anybody gave Adam and Eve the information like, hey, the snake didn't come in and say, hey, did you guys realize that you weren't not wearing any clothes? Like, let's keep it PG in the garden here, fellas. Let's put some clothes on. He doesn't say anything like that. He deceives them into eating, and because of that, they now understand. They now have lost the righteousness of God covering their lives, and they understand, they see what's in front of them. But yet God still asks them, who told you? To give him a little bit of leeway, to give him a little bit of opportunity to come before him and say, nobody told me, Lord. Let me tell you what actually happened. 3 questions in all. Again, right, when God says, who told you? He's not ignorant to the answer or anything like that. He understands perfectly what he's doing. And he says, have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you that you should not eat? Question number 3, right there. Now, the reason that God uses this question, the reason that God says this to him, is because he points out the true cause of Adam's nakedness. It's one of those things like he's a loving parent. He's the one that knows more. And he says, where are you? Who told you you were naked? Have you eaten of that tree? He points out to Adam, this is a digging question. Right? And he says this in order to remove any excuse of ignorance and to bring conviction and to elicit confession from Adam's life. That's what he's doing. He's saying, I know exactly why you can see, why you're afraid, why you and Eve now understand that you're naked here in the garden. I know. This is symptomatic of sin. This is something that you have done, and I understand, and I'm asking you again to say, have you done this thing? It's interesting. I was listening to a lesson on this earlier, and it was talking about this idea of parents and children and the reason that we tell kids not to do stuff. And there's one camp that says that we need to sit our kids down and explain every little bit of information to them about what's going to happen if they don't follow the rules. And there's another camp that says, listen to me because I say so. I'm in that camp, honestly. I've been in that camp for a long time. Now, when I was younger and as a kid, I definitely was in the camp that said, my parents need to explain it. If they tell me not to do it, they need to tell me why. And as I get older, and as I have my own kids, I start to understand, well, I've got a little bit more life experience than them. I know the results of doing these things that I'm telling these kids not to do, and I'm trying to make sure that they step on the right path, that their life is better, not worse. I'm not trying to take anything away from them. I'm trying to make sure that they get something. I'm trying to make sure that they're not hindered. And that's the thing. God knows. God knew exactly what was going to happen, but he didn't sit down and he didn't detail to Adam and Eve, do not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because then you will have your eyes opened and you will understand good and evil. But you'll also understand everything that brings along with it, and life will be rough. He doesn't sit down and say that, but he knows it to begin with. And he commanded Adam not to eat, and that should have been enough. Just like a good child should submit to the authority of their parents because they trust them that they know better. Adam and Eve should have trusted God, but the serpent deceived them, specifically deceived Eve. And so God says, have you eaten of the tree of which I command you that you shouldn't eat? That's just one of those things, it's like what was going through Adam's head when he heard that. He's like, oh man, he's got to know. I guess he knows. Maybe thinking in his head before, like, he can't know if I can talk my way out of this. But he understands here, no, God knows. He understands what he's asking. He didn't ask me if I ate of this other tree at the other end of the river, the tree of nakedness or whatever it is. He said, have you eaten of this tree, the one that I commanded you not to? And again, he does that to elicit the confession. He wants to let Adam know, I know what you've done. I just need you to tell me. And that's exactly what happens. Adam confesses, albeit he confesses pretty poorly. It's really not, if you're taking notes on how to confess your sin, don't look at this as an example of what to do. Look at it as an example of what not to do. Here's what he says, verses 12 through 13 is the next section that we're going to cover. He says, it says there in verse 12, then the man said, the woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me of the tree, and I ate. Immediately, when he understands that there's no way that he's going to talk his way out of this, that now he understands that I'm caught here. There's no way that I can convince the Lord that there was something else that happens. Adam understands that God knows everything. The minute that he understands that, he confesses, but he doesn't want to take the full brunt of the blame. Adam tries to shift blame not only on this gift of God, the gift that God gave him, this helper, this woman that you gave me, Lord, the woman whom you gave to me, she gave me of the tree. He doesn't shift blame only to her, but in that same sentence, he not only shifts blame to the gift, but to the giver as well, to God himself. He says, the woman that you gave me, Lord. Again, it's a pretty terrible way to confess something. Pretty terrible way to say sorry. You know? Like, oh, well, bump into somebody at the, in a parking lot, you driving your car, smack into somebody's bumper or whatever. You have to get out of the car, say, oh, I'm sorry. And I know what they say. Never admit fault, which is okay, like I get it for insurance purposes, but we're Christians. Usually it's never like, oh, I'm sorry that happened. It's like, well, you're parked over the line. It's your fault that I hit you. Like that's a ridiculous way to confess. It's a ridiculous way to apologize. But this is what Adam does. He tries to shift blame over to God, back on God himself. Adam failed again in a very short time span. He failed when he took the fruit. I want to say apple, misspeak. When he took the fruit and he ate of it, he failed when instead of running to God, he hides himself. And he fails in his confession. It's not a good one. He's trying to shift the blame over. Here's some application for us to think about as well. Why is it so difficult for mankind to simply admit that we're wrong? Why is that such a problem for us? There's that old joke, like, what are the 3 most difficult words for a man to say? It's like, oh, it's I love you. No, it's I was wrong. For some reason, we don't want to be wrong. It's prideful. It's something that we want to hold on to. We want to be right about something, and we will take that pride all the way to our grave in the same way that Adam literally is doing. He's prideful about what he had done wrong. And it's interesting, again, how we're coupling everything together with what we're learning in the Gospels and what we're learning on Wednesday nights throughout the book of Genesis. But when it's put in our face about what it is that we have done wrong, the only way to gain God's mercy from that is to come to him humbly, like we've been talking about with Mary. Like we've been saying over and over, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. That pride that we hold on to is that is simply just saying, I want to be right. I have to believe that Adam had some sort of understanding on who God was. Did he truly believe that all God was going to do is just squash him like a bug if he would just come clean and let him know what happened and tell him that he had failed? Honestly, what's the worst thing for us if we admit that we're wrong on something? Maybe that's going to result in something bad happening at your job. Maybe you're going to get demoted. Possibly you get fired. But most of the time, if you are humble enough just to say, I was wrong, I screwed up, there is mercy there, not just from the Lord, but from everybody. This is what people want to hear. I'll tell you guys a little bit of story of my job when I moved out to California for a few months. I was working for a machine shop. I had never actually worked in a machine shop before, ever in my life. But this is the job that God gave me. I think I told you guys a story about how I got a job that God gave me that I wasn't asking for, and I really wasn't qualified to do that, other than I worked as a mechanic before, and I had some idea of like how to deal with machines and just had some mechanically inclined thinking. But I got this job, and I was flown all the way out to California so I could train at this facility for 3 months, and on the very first week, I'm being trained on how to utilize these tools. And there's this, we call it a through coolant drill bit. This really high-priced drill bit, and whenever I was working, they weren't super common either. The drill bit that we received, we'd been waiting on for like almost 3 weeks for this part that we needed to put into production so that we could get it out and orders to the customers and all that stuff, and we were already a little bit behind. And I was told how to install this tool and how to match the offsets and everything. And then we were told to, it was me and a couple other guys that were training together, and we were told, I want you to put in this drill bit, but be very, very careful with it. It was very expensive, and it's going to be a while before we can get another one. And so as we're installing it, I go to run the machine and I did something incorrectly. And the drill bit comes down and smashes against the stock part and it just explodes. It explodes. I've never seen a drill bit explode before, but it was pretty cool, but also, made my heart sink. And my two buddies who started with me, they're good guys, they like me, and they started to discuss what we were going to do, how we were going to talk our way out of this stuff. And at this point in time, I've been walking with the Lord long enough that I understand it's just not how it works. And I just kind of sighed, and I was like, because in my old job, I would have to pay for that out of my pocket, or they'd let me go. That's it. And I sighed, and I thought, well, it's my first week here. I guess I'm going back home. This job wasn't for me. And I walked into into the business owner's office there, and I just simply told him, I screwed up. I broke it. And I fully expected to get fired. And he said, okay, we'll order a new one. That's it. That's all we got. That's the grace of God. That's it. How different would that have turned out if I would have listened to my buddies over here and said, okay, we'll figure out a way to cover it up. And he comes out into the shop and nobody had told him that it was broken. How different would my life have turned out if I just, would have tried to cover it up? God gives us grace when we do the things that he tells us to do, when we follow the actions that he wants us to follow, when we do right by him, he gives us grace. When we are humble enough to admit and say, I screwed this up. The responsibility and the fault is on me, not on anybody else. It sucks. It's not a great feeling to have. And like I said, my heart sank. My stomach hurt a little bit. I was like, man, how am I going to explain this to my wife? And I'm telling you guys, it was absolutely 100% the grace of God that's what the reaction was. This is what God is looking for from us. He wants to hear our confessions when we do wrong. And he loves us. And like a good parent, he wants to correct that behavior because it will only be better for us if we follow what he says. But that's not what Adam does. He says, the woman who you gave me, she gave me of the tree. That's the reason, the purpose for what he'd done. And then we get that little confession at the end, and I ate. Man, Adam, if you would have just said less, just say, I ate of the tree, Lord. Yes, I did. When he says, have you eaten? Have you eaten of that tree that I commanded you not to eat? He would have just said, I ate of that, Lord. I did that. How different things could have turned out. That was all that God needed. That's all that he was looking for to get from Adam. He wanted a confession, and he got one. It was a poor one. It wasn't great, but he got that confession, and he turns his gaze from Adam, and he starts to talk to Eve immediately. He doesn't ask Adam any more questions after that. He simply was looking for a confession, and he got one. And the blame was shifted over to Eve, and it's not that God said, oh, you know what, Adam, you're right. Let me talk to this woman. She definitely screwed up. Let's talk to her. No, he doesn't do that. She was also at fault, and he's needing to hear a confession from her as well. Just because we're married doesn't mean that we get a group discount on our confessions. Right? So he turns his attention on Eve. And there in verse 13 it says, and the Lord said to the woman, what is this that you have done? Simple, straight to the point. I think God is hoping that by questioning Eve, perhaps 50% of humanity will do the right thing. And I just kind of want to ask you guys, what do you think with Eve? Did she do the right thing? I know, here's a story that we hear all the time. It's the blame game, passing the buck. Adam was at fault. God asked him what he did, and he blames Eve. Then God turns to Eve, and he says, what did you do? And she blames the serpent, and she points at her. Well, let's look at what it is that she said. The woman said, the serpent deceived me, and I ate. I'm not really sure you can call that blame shifting. Granted, she probably should have just said, I ate, instead of trying to make excuses or anything like that, but this is literally what happened. She was deceived, and she ate. Maybe she was mentioning the serpent to shift the blame down. I'm not going to discount that idea. That's a possibility of that's what she was doing. Maybe she was trying to say, I don't want I mean, she just saw what happened, like, oh, well, Adam blamed me, and I got the attention shifted to me. Maybe I can blame the serpent, and the attention will be shifted over to him. But I think she was giving an accurate account of what had happened. She was deceived, and then she ate. Maybe she was given an excuse for eating, but it wasn't a good excuse. Her deception, what she was deceived by, is just as much of a confession for her of sinning as when she said, I ate. The fact that she allowed herself to be deceived is a sinful action. She exchanged the truth for a lie, which is one of the many characteristics of the unrighteous person that's listed in the book of Romans. I'll give you a little bit of that from the book of Romans chapter 1, verses 24 and 25. It says, therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness in their lusts of their hearts to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. This idea that she knew the truth, that she was not supposed to eat of that tree. Granted, what we went over last week was that she was a little bit confused on all the details. She said, we're not supposed to eat of it. We're not even supposed to touch that tree. She added information onto that, but she did know she wasn't supposed to do that, and she did know that that information came down from God. God gives the truth, and she exchanged that truth that was given her by God for a lie that was from Satan. And ultimately, that's what was the cause of this conversation that she's having to have with God right here and now. So when she says, the serpent deceived me, I think possibly this is a confession of sin as well. Understand that, guys. When we exchange the truth of God for the lies of the world, it's sinful action. It's not just us being dum-dums or going along with the flow of anything like that and just trying to make sure that, our peers don't have to pressure us too much so we can kind of go with everything. It is literally going the opposite direction of where God wants us to go. If we want to say anything about, maybe homosexuality is okay, it's their life, they're not bothering anybody else. Yeah, we can say that. Like, I've got a brother who's homosexual. That's a lifestyle that he lives, and I love him to death. But just because I love him, it doesn't outweigh what God has told me about what's right and what's wrong. Just because it literally has caused problems in my family for me to take that stance doesn't mean that I can walk back on God's truth so that I can have an easier time in life around me. Sometimes we need to be persecuted for the truth because we don't want to exchange what God has already said as truth for the lies of the world. Ultimately, where we will live for eternity is going to be with God, not the people around us. I mean, maybe the people around us. Maybe you guys are going to be around each other for eternity, hopefully. There's a lot of people that you won't be that are going to want to shift your views, that are going to want to say something different. But it's sinful action. Just as bad as Adam and Eve eating. In fact, it's the sin that led to the sin. And so she says, the serpent deceived me and I ate. And so God's attention once again shifts and he moves to the serpent. No questions this time. He doesn't say, well, Satan, tell me what happened here. What's your side of the story? No, God knows. He understands. He has a clear understanding of who Satan is. But once again, once he receives the admission of guilt, whether that was her saying the serpent deceived me, but it definitely was that she ate, he says, okay, I've got my admission of guilt from her as well. I'm going to move on, turn my attention to the serpent. And he says, no questions or anything like that. So the Lord said to the serpent, because you have done this, you are cursed more than all the cattle and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you shall go, and you shall eat dust all the days of your life. Again, no question there that of who Satan was or his character. Simply, we get the judgment that is already being passed down from God before he asks Satan anything. And it's interesting what he says there, and I've heard a lot of stuff about this, that, okay, well, the first part of this curse is to the serpent himself. because he took part in this, but it really was Satan. And then the second half of it is for Satan. But I think it's all for Satan here. I think everything that the Lord is saying here is towards Satan. Again, I think there's a few possibilities of what's going on here. When he says that you are cursed more than all the cattle, more than every beast of the field, on your belly you shall go, it could very well be, and I'll remind you of this before I actually give you these ideas. The world before the flood was different. There is nothing, no scientific experiment that you can do here to prove what the world was like pre-flood. The things that were happening in the garden and in that world are unlike anything that we have ever seen. Might as well have been a different planet. The moisture in the air and the way that the water came up from the ground, and apparently the animals spoke, that God would create things out of the dust and walk in the garden with Adam and Eve. These are all things that do not happen today, that we have no perception of what it was like. So when somebody asks you, why is it that God cursed the snake to crawl on its belly when that's what he does in the first place? We don't know that that's what he did in the first place. Could very well have been that the snake looked very different than what he looks like today. Could look more like a lizard. I don't know. And it does say serpent. The definition of serpent is kind of broad. It's kind of wide for what it could be. But this snake that he says that you're going to crawl on your belly from now on moving forward, it could literally be that he changed the appearance and the nature of that serpent to resemble what we now know as a snake. Or it could be that God is speaking metaphorically to Satan himself, and he's educating him that he will never rise up to the status that he desires. And that he will, to use a modern phrase, eat God's dust. And that he will constantly be chasing after the glory and the accomplishments of who God is, trying to imitate those things, but he'll always be left behind. That he will literally be in the dirt. That this is what Satan wanted, was to rise above God and who he was. And when he says, you're going to be cursed more than all the cattle of the field, I think he was talking to Satan. I don't think he was just talking to the snake. I think there's parts of that go along with the snake because of parts that the part that he had taken in it. But I think he's talking to Satan, saying if your goal is to rise above to a status up to above the throne that I have, it will never happen. You will crawl on your belly and you will eat the dust. Could be, obviously, that both of these things are absolutely true at the same time. Right? That is both talking to the snake, that is both talking to Satan. That's just the first part of the curse. It says that you will be lower than all the cattle. He says in verse 15, this declaration of war that God gives to Satan right here. This is both where it starts, and frankly, God's going to talk about where it ends right here. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Enmity between you and the woman is what he says. It's interesting that the conflict will be between Satan and the woman, not the man. I'll put enmity between you and the woman. It's not to say that Satan doesn't have enmity with man as well, all mankind, but specifically the woman. It's even more interesting whenever you couple what is being said here with what is said in Revelation chapter 12. Revelation chapter 12, verses 4 and 5, it says, his tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born. She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and his throne. We're going to go over here a little bit about what he's talking about prophetically with Mary. But this woman, this picture of this woman, even though this is written in Revelation, is a picture of Israel. That he will put enmity between Satan and the woman. The woman referred to in the book of Revelation is the nation of Israel. And this is why we see time after time throughout history, Satan is trying to thwart God's plan, and his attacks become more and more directed as God reveals more and more of his plan. He says the second part of that is going to be how he is defeated, and so Satan wants to stop that. I mean, we said poor dumb Adam, but poor dumb Satan. Adam thought he could hide from God. Satan foolishly, stupidly makes a mistake that he can defeat God. And so he's trying to thwart God's plan at every step and every turn. First, because he doesn't know, specifically, God hasn't revealed to Abraham that the Messiah would come through him. He goes after the world itself. We're going to read, maybe next week, it might be 2 weeks from now, Cain and Abel. Right? That sin that controls there in that relationship causes the first murder, and he just wants to stop all people altogether. He introduces not just death, as what's introduced here in this chapter, but murder into the world, trying to thwart God's plan there. And later, when Abraham is given the covenant, Satan tries to destroy them. I mean, a lot of different ways. I can give you a few examples. One of them is the Pharaoh that wants to kill all those babies whenever Moses is washed down the river, because the people are crying out for deliverance over their oppressors, Egypt. And Satan wants to say, maybe we can wipe out all of Israel through Egypt. And so we'll, press hard on either side, and we'll crush in and try and destroy them there, looking for different ways to thwart God's plan. A little bit later on down, and it'll get a little bit more funneled into, and these hints and clues as to who the Messiah is going to be, and the promise is given to David. Again, like we were talking on Sunday, where it was promised to Abraham and then to David, and it whittles down from the entire nation of Israel to the nation of Judah, and we see what happens. Pagan religion creeps in to Israel. They start to worship on the high places. The nations split. Judah alone, well, they've got Benjamin there, but the very small portion of that tribe, all those kings, a few of them were good, but they're all pretty bad. All coming in for pagan worship. And he attacks, as we learned on Sunday, he attacks the mind and the actions of the king so much that Jeconiah, one of the last remaining descendants of King David, is told that nobody through his bloodline would sit on the throne of David. I have to imagine that at that point in time, Satan was doing somersaults, thinking, this is it? He said it had to come from the line of David. This is the last one on the line of David, and he's been cursed. He's not going to be allowed to reign on the throne anymore. Done. Squashed it. But as we saw on Sunday, as we went over the genealogies, that there's the loopholes that God found, and a way for God to still come out on top. It's not that he found a loophole, it's that he always knew exactly what was going to happen. But Satan attacks the woman, enmity with the woman. This woman, it was a symbolic picture of Israel as a whole. And it says there will be enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. So we'll talk about the her seed here in just a second, but your seed, Satan's seed. I had to ask myself, what does that mean? We understand the seed, singular, is Jesus, the Messiah, coming from the woman. We talked about that a lot over the last few weeks, both Sunday and Wednesday night. But what is the seed of Satan? Is it singular? Is it for one purpose? Is it the Antichrist, maybe? Maybe there's going to be this big battle between Jesus and the Antichrist, but we understand that there's no real war there. It's not even a comparison. I don't think that the serpent seed means physical descendants of Satan. I don't think that it was the Nephilim that actually descendants, that it's Satan somehow manifested in man himself, that through a physiological sense, but I think it's symptomatic of the spiritual descendants of Satan. Those that want to follow after Satan's will and do his work here on earth, those spiritual descendants of Satan. And I think this is why when John is speaking to the Pharisees and Sadducees, that it digs so deeply at what he calls them. In Matthew chapter 3, verse 7 says, but when he, speaking of John, the baptizer, when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming to his baptism, he said to them, brood of vipers, who warned you to flee the wrath to come? These people that were doing Satan's work, John calls them vipers, snakes. Later on in the book of Matthew, Jesus is going to use that same exact term, brood of vipers, to indicate that they are the spiritual descendants of Satan. That what they are trying to do, although they think they're the good guys, is carrying out Satan's plan. And so Satan's seed, when it says there will be enmity between you and the woman and between your seed and her seed, Satan's seed is those that want to follow, the people on this earth that want to further Satan's plan either wittingly or unwittingly. And then it says, and her seed. Now, I'm sure you guys have probably heard this a lot. I know it's something that I've heard a lot if you've been studying the Bible. Biologically speaking, it's the male that carries the seed, not the female. And so it says here between your seed and her seed. Physiologically impossible. But of course, this is no surprise to you guys that have been coming here on Sunday as we just covered the virgin birth. Her seed. Mary did not conceive with the help of any man. She was impregnated supernaturally by the Lord. Without any seed involved, it was hers. Through her seed. So this is a prophetic statement to reference the virgin birth. And again, I think we've hit that a number of times over the last few weeks, so I'm not going to go too deep into that. But it says here, he shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. This is the last thing that we get about the curse that is upon Satan. He shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. There's many instances when Satan at least believes that he's won. I mean, like I said, we talked about Jack and I bet you, even at the cross, thinking, we've done it. He came to save the world and we put him up on a cross and he's dead. I bet you there was times there when he thought he had won. But he was striking at the heel. And obviously, a strike to the heel is ultimately the inferior blow than that of a strike to the head. Again, not to bombard you guys with my hobbies or anything like that, but jiu-jitsu is a ministry of the church. If I'm actually utilizing that martial art form in the real world, I'm not going to go for an arm bar. I'm not going to go for a heel hook. I'm going to choke the person out. Because a blow to the head will stop the fight. While taking out someone's arm, they might continue. It's a lesser and inferior blow, that to the heel than that to the head. The superior blow was dealt by Jesus himself. Jesus will crush the head of Satan. It'll bruise his head. And I think it's really interesting the way that it's phrased here too, because he starts out, he says, he shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. He talks about him having his head bruised before he talks about the heel, right? You'd think it'd be the other way around. It's like, it's like, thinking like a boxing fight in Hollywood or something like that. Like the main character, the protagonist, he's, getting beat up and knocked around a little bit, but he's still in the fight. But that's not really the way that God describes it. I think the way that he says is by mentioning that he's going to bruise the head before he bruises the heel. It almost seems like God is excited to deliver the news of how he's going to defeat Satan. He will bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. Nothing. Tidbits of the amount of force. The difference. Then, of course, where the snake is, down by the heel of man, the way that we kill snakes, taking off their heads, cutting their heads, that sort of stuff. The superior blow will be from Jesus to Satan. But Jesus still takes a bruising. For people who, I was listening to a podcast, even it was an older one between, you guys probably know the names, John MacArthur, Ben Shapiro, this guy who's of the Jewish religion, someone who's a pretty strong Christian, talking to each other about things and things that are in the Old Testament and how they refer to the New Testament and stuff like that. This idea that the serpent will bruise the heel. There will still be a bruising that is taken, bruised for our transgressions, as it says in Isaiah, that Jesus will have to take. Because as God looks at Adam and says, "Where are you? What have you done? Did you eat from the tree?" And he looks at Eve and he says, "What have you done?" He gets their confession and there still has to be punishment. God is just and he must punish sin. But like you said, thankfully for us, God is merciful and he takes that punishment out on one who didn't deserve it so that the penalty could be paid for us. And the beautiful and brilliant part of that is that after the crucifixion and the burial, Jesus did not stay entombed. He rose to defeat death. And I think I need to hurry up if I'm going to get to the point that I'm trying to make. We get first to the curse or the punishment, the initial thing that he says to the woman. Verse 16 is to the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In your pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. The punishment that we see here for womankind is twofold. It's made up of two different parts. The first is motherhood, and the second is marriage. So over motherhood, he says, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. It doesn't say sorrow in conception. Now, the word that's used there for sorrow and the word that's used right after conception for pain, it can be used interchangeably for one or the other. But it says, I will multiply your sorrow and your conception. So you shall, in pain you shall bring forth children. So there's this idea of bringing forth children being painful, which if you've had a child in here, I'm sure you can attest to that. That's true. That's something that's been carried out by the Lord. It's punishment that's there. And it's actually been observed that women, human women, when they bring forth a child, they do that with more pain than almost most other creatures. I mean, if you watch Nature Channel and stuff like that, or you've seen or helped out with any sort of like animal births or stuff like that, it's not as crazy intense. It's usually not extremely painful for the animal. I imagine it was probably, unless something's wrong, usually. It can be, but generally, right, it will always be painful to have a child as a woman. And it wasn't like that, or it wasn't supposed to be like that while they were still in the garden. So, you guys can blame me for that one. I can't attest to any of that physical pain, but along with that physical pain, there's also psychological and emotional pain. It says, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. There's physiological and emotional pain that comes both from having children, like the physical part of having children. The postpartum depression is a real thing. Anything postpartum of your body just acclimating to the changes that having a child does to your body. There's that part of it that's psychologically and physiologically difficult. And there's also pain from not having children, infertility, right? There's this yearning for a lot of women to want to have children, and it's caused a lot of pain. Now, some women are a little bit different than that, but this comes along with part of what God is saying here of the punishment that is given for women. Greatly multiply your sorrow. Now that continues on even as they get older. I think a lot of people can attest that women have a more emotional attachment to their children than men do. I'm not going to say I don't love my kids, but I think it'd be pretty hard to fight my wife when she says that she loves them more. And I love my kids like an infinite amount, but I believe her when she says it. It's different for a mom. And the way they're attached to their kid, and the sorrow and the hurt that their hearts will feel if something happens or those kids go in the wrong direction, it's different. And that sorrow is multiplied for women. And again, the second part of that punishment is over marriage. It says there that your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Now, the word there where it says desire, it's interesting because you think, oh, well, your desire will be for your husband. That's a good thing. You want your wife to desire you. But the way that it's used in the context is different than what we might just read it on a surface level. And we can gain context and understanding from the next chapter because it's used in the exact same way in Genesis chapter 4, verse 7. I'll read that part to you and see if you can pick it up. If you do well, and he's talking to Cain, if you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door. Here it is. And its desire is for you, but you should rule over it. Same author, same person writing these chapters back to back, uses the same phrasing in both places. The way that it's meant there in chapter 4 is that sin wants to rule over Cain, but he should rule over it. So when it says here, your desire shall be for your husband, but he shall rule over you, the idea here is that women will have a desire to rule over their husbands, but the authority within a marriage is given to a man. Now that system had already been established, right? We don't want to, we've just been talking all about all this stuff, how Adam is responsible. Adam is held responsible even for Eve's shortcomings. That idea is already established back in Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, whenever we talked about, and the Lord God said, it is not good that man should be alone. I will make a helper comparable to him. It's always been this relationship where the man has authority over the woman in a marriage relationship. But now there's going to be resistance to that submission, that women will feel resistance to the submission and the order that God has already put in place. So there was something that God had already done, and now after the fall, it's going to be much more difficult for women to deal with this. And what I will say is that maybe that's not you, but we're going to go over that a little bit later. Going through premarital counseling with a lot of people, this is one of the biggest issues that comes up with people who don't have a close relationship to God. When we say that the order that God has placed things in is that he wants the wife to be submissive to the husband. Like what it says all throughout the New Testament, what Paul is talking about, which, by the way, he gets that idea from this section of Scripture. That's the red flag. That's the part that a lot of women have a problem with. Now, we know that this is what God intends. And if the husband is doing his job the way that God intends, and the woman is doing her job the way that God intends, then everything should work out great. But we don't see the way that it should work out. We see our own selfish desires, what we want to do. And I don't have time to go into it now, but there's a lot of different ways that even unwittingly, women can try and control the actions of their husband, and it's a desire that they'll have. And it is a desire that's there because in the same way that childbirth is a real thing, this desire is a real thing. And what we should understand is if we want to submit to the order of what God had intended, then there's a certain way that wives need to be with their husbands, and a certain way that husbands need to be with their wife that is prescribed by the creator of the universe himself, the one who invented marriage. And I'll go quickly through this section here now as well. Then he turns to Adam and he gives him his punishment. He says, then to Adam he said, because you have heeded the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat, cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. So he says there to Adam, because you heeded the voice of your wife. Now the problem here, and I want to make this very, very clear as we're talking about submission to husbands and all this stuff, the problem is not that Adam took Eve's advice. It's not that, oh, you took advice from a woman. How dare you do that? Don't you know that that's wrong? That's not the problem. The problem is the advice that Eve was giving. It was not only bad advice, it was directly against what God had commanded. So he's not saying, husbands, don't listen to your wives, because you heeded the voice of your wife, that's the punishment. It's not that he was taking her advice. Our wives give us good advice at times. And as a matter of fact, my life changed having my wife in my life because there are so many things. And I know I've got a conscience. I've got God tell me not to do bad things. But I can tell you so many times when I want to do or say something or act a certain way, I've got this little voice in the back of my head that sounds surprisingly like my wife. In the same way that she says, be nice, that's good advice from my wife. And I don't think God's going to get on me for taking that advice from her, right? About things that I should do. But it's the advice that she gave, not that she was giving advice. When she handed him the fruit, it was directly against what God had said. And if anybody, up to and including your wife, gives you a directive that is opposite of what God wants you to do, we always need to turn and take God's advice, not anybody else's. So it's not that she was giving him advice, it was the advice that she had given. He says, curse is the ground for your sake. Because of Adam's actions, because he decided to eat of it, there's a curse that's put on all creation. Before the curse, the ground only produced good plants. But now there's going to be thorns and thistles, as it says there in verse 18. But thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat of the herb of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to the dust you shall return. Thorns start to sprout up where there was only good plants before, and they grow faster and easier than any of the good fruit. This, and we're going to look at this here in a second, but the idea of the crown of thorns that was placed on Jesus' head, it goes to a whole higher meaning because of this curse. and what it actually meant. Adam worked before the curse. In the same way that Eve was supposed to be submissive to her husband before the curse, Adam worked before the curse. So it's not like there's anything different that's going on here. He says that you will toil the ground. But all the joy was now gone. And now with that work comes pain and weariness, whereas before there wasn't there. There is a right way to do everything. While we are submitting to God's authority, it's easy for us to do the right thing. It was easy. While they were listening to God, while they had still undertaken his commandments and they listened to what he said, it was easy for them to do what God had told them. It was easy for Eve to submit to Adam, and it was easy for Adam to do the work that God had for him. But after rebelling on God's authority, those things changed. It became way more difficult for them to do the things that they were already said. Now there was going to be a desire for Eve to rule over Adam. Now there's going to be sweat pouring from Adam when he does the work. And give you a little bit of a point of application here. If you are finding that your role is difficult, then perhaps you are not fully submitting to God's authority. And I mean that in a lot of different ways. Now, yeah, it's supposed to be hard to get a shovel and dig a hole. You're supposed to sweat. But there's a lot of other things that it becomes difficult on once you refuse to submit to God's authority. If you understand what God says about your chain of command and the authorities that he has placed over you and who you're supposed to listen to, it should make your workplace a lot easier. And you can understand that my boss at work has authority over me. And what he says goes so long as it's not directly against what God has already told me to do. In the same way, wives, if you're finding it troublesome to submit to your husbands, I would say, perhaps you're not fully submitting to God's authority. Now, there are other reasons why it could be difficult to submit to your husband's authority. But if your biggest problem is, I want to be in control, I want to be in control, I want to be in control, we're not submitting to God's authority and what he has said first. I can tell you, and I know my wife's not here right now to defend herself, she's at home with a sick kiddo, but if you ask her, she'll say that she has no problem submitting to my authority in the household. And that's because when we got married to each other, we promised we're always going to love God first and then our spouse. I told my wife, I'm always going to love God more than I love you. And she said, that's not a problem because it's going to be the same for me. I'm always going to love God more than I love you. And because of that, it's easy for her to have submission to me in our marriage. Because if I love God more than I love her, well, I'm doing what God told me to do, to love her in the same way that Christ loved the church, to sacrifice for her. And if I'm doing that, it makes it easy for her to submit to me because everything that she has to submit to me for is because I love her and I want good things for her. And so if we're finding it hard in our different roles, even if it's at work, whether it's in your marriage or whatever it is, there might be a root cause to that problem. And the root cause might be that we are not submitting to God's authority first and foremost over everything. So I'm probably going to, I'm going to back up and I'll run over this one more time next week. And I know I'm pretty much over time here, but I will end on verse 19. It says here, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for dust you are and dust you shall return. God says, listen, it's going to be hard for you to work the land now. It's going to be difficult, but don't worry. You do not have to toil forever. One day, you'll be dead. One day, you're going to die. The final stage of the curse is death. What did God say? Do not eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, for the day that you do, you will surely die. They died spiritually when their clothing of righteousness was gone. And now they have to face the death of their flesh, which they would not have had to face before if it was not for the disobedience to what God says. And that final stage of death extends to all of Adam's descendants. And if you don't know if that's you or not, it's you. We all came from Adam. We're going to cover that pretty thoroughly next week. I'll tell you that much. We all came from Adam. We're all his descendants, and that penalty of death extends to all of us. Paul makes that abundantly clear in the book of Romans. If you read through chapter 5, it's like, man, he's really wailing on Adam. I'll read a few of these verses for you guys. Romans chapter 5, verse 12. Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men because all sinned. Romans chapter 5, verse 15 says, but the free gift is not like the offense, for if by one man's offense many died, much more the grace of God and the gift by the grace of one man, Jesus Christ, abounded to many. And then verse 17 through 19 of chapter 5, it says, for if by one man's offense death reigned through the one, much more those who receive abundance of grace and of the gift of righteousness will reign in the life through one, Jesus Christ. Therefore, as through one man's offense, judgment came to all men, resulting in condemnation, even so through one man's righteousness, the act of free gift came to all men, resulting in the justification of life. For as by one man's disobedience, many were made sinners, so also by one man's obedience, many will be made righteous. Through that one man, Adam, death entered the world. Death reigns over our life. Death has a hold over us. It's inescapable. But as we are learning as we go through the Gospels, particularly Luke, the second Adam will come to succeed where the first Adam failed. And through that one man's righteousness, we will all be saved if you choose to believe in what he has done to save you. So the dismal fact is that maybe you didn't eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and you still have to pay for the actions of one man, Adam. But God has provided a way through one man to be saved. Let's pray.